Hello to all of the Vandenbergers. This is Douglas Murray, and it's a great pleasure to be with you all, albeit virtually, for this first virtual Vandenberg conference. I should start by saying, of course, what a pleasure it is to be back with you all, albeit virtually, and how much I'm looking forward to the ensuing discussion. There are lots of downsides to not being able to meet in person. I suppose if there's one upside this year, it'll be that it'll be easier to work out and delineate the bar bill than perhaps it is always or has always been in previous years. But I very much look forward to the next time we can all congregate in person again, and I know that all of you will be feeling exactly the same, and I look forward to seeing you back at a physical location next year. I've been asked today to talk about the promise and perils of human rights for this day on the subject of human rights and what our attitudes towards this issue may perhaps be, and specifically on the issue of restoring human rights to their proper fundamentals. And I wanted to start by laying out three examples of where I think the skepticism, shall we say, that exists in this area among many of us originates from. Examples, if you like, of the overreach of human rights. First, I want to take us back a few years, earlier this decade, 2013, when a UN special rapporteur called Raquel Rolnick came from Brazil to my own country, to the United Kingdom, to report as a UN special rapporteur. Ms. Rolnick did a 2-week tour of the UK. She did so specifically, it appeared, to do work on housing, and housing in the UK in particular. She was very clear from early on, appeared to be borrowing a lot of language as well as policy from the then opposition Labour Party. And specifically, Ms. Rolnick appeared to be exercised, shall we say, by an issue that was coincidentally also exercising the Labour opposition of the day. This was a now obscure part of recent political history, involving something that was rather brilliantly described by the Labour Party as a spare room tax or a bedroom tax, and involved, and this will bore endlessly those of you in non-British countries, but it involved a specific issue over whether or not people who lived in council housing should be encouraged to move out of the property that they lived in that the state had given them if there was a surplus bedroom. One of the arguments was that plenty of young professionals couldn't afford a spare room. Lots of people who worked hard-working families and so on, didn't have a spare room. And so perhaps it was unfair that people who lived in council housing did have a spare room. This was, of course, a politically contentious issue that came about in a government dedicated to trying to find places to find government spending cuts. In any case, Ms. Rolnick came from Brazil and appeared particularly coincidentally exercised by this issue of the spare bedroom tax in the UK. She ended up delivering her verdict on the UK after her 2-week tour, and suggested, among other things, that the idea of rent controls in the private sector was a particular issue of concern to her. She condemned the right to buy policy on council homes, which had started many years earlier, and insisted in particular that more public money should be spent on building social housing. But as I say, her main area of concern in the UK was the spare bedroom issue, that is, the so-called bedroom tax. She said that this was a regressive policy, and much more. Now, why do I raise this issue of a 2013 controversy? Well, Unsurprisingly, not everybody in Britain took Miss Rolnick's swift tour of the UK in the spirit of acceptance and generosity. In fact, they rather regarded it as their duty to return the lack of generosity that Miss Rolnick showed to the UK. A number of newspapers pointed out that Brazil itself, the country Miss Rolnick was from, has around 54 million people living without clean water or sanitation, and that there are an estimated 30 million homeless in the city of Sao Paulo and 625,000 living below the poverty line. This was not only something pointed out in the press. The then Work and Pension Secretary, Ian Duncan Smith, threatened to complain to Ban Ki-moon, the head of the UN. A Tory MP called Stuart Jackson, in a rather unusually clear intervention by a Conservative MP, described Miss Rolnick as, quote, a loopy Brazilian lefty. The tabloids in Britain were thrilled to discover that Miss Rolnick was a follower of something called Candomblé, a religion linked, they said, to slavery and the worship of African gods. And the British tabloid press, in one of those fits of genius that make them loved and reviled in equal measure, I find, decided to christen Miss Rolnick the Brazil Nut. So this was an episode, as I say, it's rather forgotten now, but an interesting example of somebody arriving in a country claiming to be interested in talking about human rights and discovering certain aspects of where human rights might be improved, but very visibly to the political class and to the general public, actually being somebody with a political agenda, simply masquerading behind the idea that they were some kind of rapporteur on human rights. 2 years ago, a very similar thing occurred when the UN sent a special rapporteur on racism to the UK to do a fact-finding report. This received equal, I think, attention in Britain for precisely the same reason. The suspicion, the fear that the rapporteur sent by the UN on this human rights issue was not being sent in a spirit of genuine curiosity, but in the spirit of a judge, jury, and executioner, rather like the scene in Blackadder when General Melchett asks for the black cap before even hearing the verdict, or indeed the evidence of the trial of Edmund Blackadder. So in 2018, the UN sent a special rapporteur on racism to the UK, and this special rapporteur, rather perhaps unsurprisingly, found that there was racism in the UK, and what's more, she said that this had been normalised since the Brexit vote. This was a sort of equivalent of a drive-by shooting in the UN Special Rapporteur human rights scene. Somebody clearly sent to do a sort of hit job on, in that case, post-Brexit Britain. I give these examples which are public, but let me just give one other example that was actually a private occasion. I won't spill names, but around the same time the UN Special Rapporteur was sent, 2017, 2018, I happened to be at a private event involving a number of very prominent figures from the world of the law in the UK and around the continent. And I was struck, and I'm going to be very careful not to break the confidences of the evening by revealing the names or identities of any of the other participants, but I was enormously struck by the fact that whereas the remit of the discussion around the table for a formal working dinner was meant to be the issue of human rights, in fact, all of the discussion from all of the legal minds in particular around the table was only focused on one issue, which was human rights as they pertained to what was then the most divisive political issue in the UK. Speaker after speaker, participant after participant talked about the Brexit vote as having been a regressive issue for human rights, and that whereas everything to do with anti-Brexit was progressive, everything to do with Brexit was regressive. So I mentioned these three examples of human rights being effectively used, or appearing to be used, as a tool to further a particular political project. For one reason in particular, which is that it was so transparent in each of these cases, two of them public, one of them private, that what was happening was nothing more than politics by other means. At the same time that these two UN rapporteurs and the private event with the many lawyers that I've just described occurred, around the same time, 500,000 people had been killed in Syria in the ongoing civil war there. Around this same time, whilst Miss Rolnick was sniffing around looking for spare bedrooms in the UK council housing area, there were hundreds of thousands of people fleeing their homes from the threat of ISIS. There was the attempt to ethnically cleanse, completely wipe out the Yazidi people. And you didn't need to look very far away from the Middle East to find it. You didn't have to just look at the Middle East. You could find similar atrocities, real human rights atrocities, happening absolutely everywhere. And I would say, bringing this slightly up to date to the present era, one of the striking things about the whole language of human rights continues to be this issue, that they are talked of as regressive in specific political contexts, at the same time as what many of us would regard as the most fundamental rights are trampled on a daily basis. That is, we see events, and again, you don't need to look to the Middle East to find this. You see events like those in American cities nightly at the moment, where private citizens see their homes, their livelihoods attacked, burnt down, where people lose their lives in the world's leading democracy. And so there's a disjunct that I think everybody on earth can see between a specific form of human rights language that has emerged and the reality of human rights abuses that is going on, and will continue to go on doubtlessly, on every continent on earth. And this has always struck me as being one of the most disturbing aspects of the whole issue of human rights in our era. Everything that is said about them has a colossal and in some ways growing disjunct with the reality that they seek to be addressing. We have the language of human rights, which describes human rights as being fundamental. We have the language of human rights that describes such rights as being inviolable. That effectively these rights are sacrosanct, a term that is indeed often used. And here is the trouble with this, which is that the publics in countries across the world can all see the giant problem, which is that these fundamental rights are fundamentally violated all the time, that these inviolable rights are violated all the time, and that rights that are presented as sacrosanct are forever being trampled over to a greater or lesser extent around the world. One of the follow-on problems from this appears to me to be the following, which is that even as the general publics in countries around the world can see the gap between the rhetoric and the reality in human rights, at the same time, the legal community, I almost said legal fraternity, the legal community around the world insists all the time on inflating the language that they are using. And there is always something revealing about it when language is inflated in the manner in which it has been in recent years. As Miss Rolnick, the Brazilian nut, demonstrated, human rights has become, in our era, a currency that suffers from the most obscene form of currency inflation. Indeed, it's undergone an inflation that I would say is unprecedented, unseen outside of Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe. Now, the temptation, of course, is to see this unbelievable inflation in the currency of human rights, the unbelievable inflation that sees the right to a spare bedroom in council housing as being sacrosanct or inviolable or fundamental indeed. That the temptation is that you see this form of inflation and that you say, and this is a particular temptation, shall I say, for conservatives in particular, you see this currency inflation and you say, to hell then with the whole enterprise, to hell with the whole currency. And there is one further reason why I think conservatives are particularly prone to that tendency to say that, to hell with the whole enterprise. And that is, of course, because of the manner in which the human rights enterprise has increasingly in our day trodden on the ground that democratic national governments should be on and should have primacy on. This was something that the late and great conservative thinker Kenneth Minogue, who many of you will have known as well as known the work of, a really wonderful thinker. This was something that Ken Minogue wrote about consistently throughout his career, and he addressed it in one of his last major essays in 2011, an essay actually that was in Standpoint magazine. He wrote this about the tendency I've just described. He said, "It's a further problem with rights that there seem to be no end of them." He said, "Enthusiasts keep discovering more and more, so that in their fullness they threaten to adumbrate a comprehensive legislative program of governance that will leave very little for democratic parliaments to do. One way of life will cover us all." Now that view, so brilliantly and as ever so eloquently summed up by Minogue, that this form of governance will leave very little for democratic parliaments to do, is most visible in the international scene, at the international bodies, principally those that have been set up by the UN, and which present such perhaps the most visible form of the inflationary currency that I just described, and that tendency that Minogue describes there of viewing it as essentially international bodies of human rights figures making the business of governance in democracies unnecessary. And the UN has no better or no worse example of this than in the UN Rights Council, Human Rights Council in Geneva. I think all of us attending this, all of us who are familiar with the discussions that go on at Vandenberg, will know that the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva is, against some pretty stiff competition, possibly the maddest place on earth. It is, I salute those people like Hillel Neuer of UN Watch, who have managed to spend years of their lives following and trying to correct the work of that body. But it is, in the eyes of many of us, an entirely lost prospect. It is exceptionally hard to retain any faith in the international game of human rights when you see, as I have done firsthand, the extraordinary...
We will make America great again.